The night was cold, but the warmth of Christmas spirit filled the air. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, blanketing the city in a soft, shimmering white. The streets were alive with the sounds of carolers singing, children laughing, and the occasional jingle of bells from passing horse-drawn carriages. It was Christmas Eve, and the city was glowing with festive cheer. Every corner seemed to radiate joy, from the twinkling lights strung across lampposts to the decorated shop windows displaying elaborate holiday scenes. Yet for Snoop Dogg, the night carried a bittersweet undertone. Earlier that evening, Snoop had performed at a community center in one of the city's less fortunate neighborhoods. It wasn't just any performance, it was a charity event he had organized himself. The room had been packed with families, many of whom were struggling to make ends meet. Snoop had brought not only his music but also a truckload of gifts for the children. Toys, books, warm clothes, and even some much-needed groceries were handed out to the families. He had also made a generous donation to the center, ensuring they could continue their work well into the new year. The performance had been electric. Snoop's smooth rhymes and laid-back charisma had the crowd on their feet, clapping and swaying to the beat. For a few hours, the weight of their struggles seemed to lift, replaced by laughter and joy. Snoop had even taken the time to meet with the kids, posing for photos, signing autographs, and listening to their stories. One little boy had tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Thank you for making this the best Christmas ever." That simple sentence had stayed with Snoop, warming his heart even as the night grew colder. As the event wrapped up, Snoop stood by the door, watching the families leave with smiles on their faces and bags of gifts in their hands. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing he had made a difference, even if just for one night. But as the last of the crowd trickled out and the community center grew quiet, a familiar feeling crept in: loneliness. Despite the love and gratitude he had received that evening, Snoop couldn't shake the emptiness that often accompanied his success. He had spent so much of his life giving to others, but in moments like these, he realized how little he had kept for himself. Deciding he needed a change of scenery, Snoop grabbed his coat and stepped out into the crisp night air. His car, a sleek black ride that seemed to glide over the snow-covered streets, was waiting for him. As he slid into the driver's seat, he took a moment to reflect. The city was alive with holiday cheer, but for Snoop, the festive lights and bustling streets only highlighted his solitude. He had friends, fans, and a career most people could only dream of, but tonight he felt the absence of something deeper, someone to share it all with. He started the car and began driving aimlessly through the city. The streets were crowded with last-minute shoppers and families heading home to celebrate. Snoop passed by groups of people laughing and chatting, their arms full of wrapped presents. He saw couples holding hands, their breath visible in the cold air as they whispered to each other. He even passed a group of kids building a snowman under the glow of a street lamp. It was a picture-perfect Christmas scene, but it only made Snoop feel more like an outsider looking in. As he drove, the city's landmarks blurred past him. The towering Christmas tree in the town square, adorned with thousands of lights and a star that seemed to touch the sky. The ice skating rink, where children wobbled and giggled as they tried to keep their balance. The church, its stained glass windows glowing warmly as a choir sang Silent Night. Each scene was a reminder of the connections and traditions that made the holiday special for so many. But for Snoop, it was just another night on the road. He turned on the radio hoping to drown out his thoughts, but every station seemed to be playing Christmas music. Jingle bells, White Christmas, All I Want for Christmas Is You. The songs were cheerful, but they only deepened his sense of isolation. He switched it off and let the silence fill the car, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of snow under the tires. After a while, Snoop realized he was hungry. The night's events had left him physically and emotionally drained, and he hadn't eaten since lunch. He remembered hearing about a restaurant downtown that was supposed to have the best late-night menu in the city. It was a fancy place, the kind of spot where people went to celebrate special occasions. Snoop figured it was as good a place as any to grab a bite and maybe lift his spirits. He turned the car toward the restaurant, navigating through the maze of one-way streets and holiday traffic. As he approached, he could see the warm glow of the restaurant's lights spilling out onto the sidewalk. The building was elegant, with large windows that offered a glimpse of the cozy interior. Inside, he could see diners laughing and toasting, their faces illuminated by the soft flicker of candlelight. It looked inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, empty streets outside. Snoop parked his car and stepped out, pulling his coat tighter against the chill. He took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. The snow was still falling, each flake unique and fleeting, much like the moments of joy he had experienced earlier that evening. He shook off the thought and walked toward the restaurant, his boots crunching against the snow. As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if he was looking for food, company, or just a distraction from the loneliness that had been following him all night. But whatever it was, he hoped he would find it inside. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped into the warmth of the restaurant, leaving the cold night behind. The restaurant stood like a beacon of luxury in the heart of the city, its grand facade glowing warmly against the cold, snowy night. Snoop Dogg had heard about this place before. Whispers of its legendary cuisine and impeccable service had reached him through friends and colleagues. It was said to be the kind of establishment where the city's elite gathered, a place where every dish was a masterpiece and every detail was carefully curated to exude sophistication. Tonight, after the emotional highs and lows of his charity event, Snoop decided he deserved to treat himself. He wanted to experience the best the city had to offer, and this restaurant seemed like the perfect choice. As he approached the entrance, the golden light spilling from the windows illuminated the snow-covered sidewalk. The building itself was a work of art, with tall glass doors framed by intricate wrought iron designs. Above the entrance, a sign in elegant script read the restaurant's name, glowing softly in the night. Through the large windows, Snoop could see the interior, a warm, inviting space filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. A massive Christmas tree stood in the center of the dining room, its branches adorned with shimmering ornaments and twinkling lights. The tree's golden star seemed to cast a glow over the entire room, adding to the festive atmosphere. Snoop adjusted his coat and stepped inside, the cold air giving way to a wave of warmth. The scent of rich, savory dishes and freshly baked bread greeted him immediately, making his stomach rumble in anticipation. The restaurant's interior was even more stunning up close. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the floors gleamed with polished marble. Chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, their crystal prisms scattering light like tiny stars. Each table was set with pristine white linens, fine china, and sparkling glassware. It was clear that no expense had been spared in creating an atmosphere of elegance and refinement. As Snoop stood in the entryway, taking it all in, he noticed the maitre d' approaching him. The man was impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, his posture straight and his expression professional. "Good evening, sir," he said with a polite smile. "Do you have a reservation?" Snoop shook his head. "Nah, man, I don't. But I heard y'all got the best food in the city, so I thought I'd stop by and see for myself." The maitre d' hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with a hint of uncertainty. "Well, we are quite busy tonight," he said, glancing over his shoulder at the dining room. "But let me see what I can do." As the maitre d' walked away to check for availability, Snoop took a moment to observe the other patrons. The restaurant was filled with well-dressed men and women, their conversations punctuated by laughter and the occasional clink of a wine glass. It was clear that this was a place for the city's upper crust, business executives, socialites, and perhaps even a few celebrities. Snoop noticed a few familiar faces among the crowd, people he had seen at industry events or on magazine covers. But as his gaze swept the room, he also noticed something else, the way some of the diners were looking at him. At first it was subtle, a few glances in his direction, quickly averted when he looked back. But as the seconds passed, the stares became more obvious. A couple seated near the bar whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward him. A group of older men at a corner table paused their conversation to glance his way, their expressions unreadable. Snoop could feel the weight of their gazes, a mix of curiosity and something less welcoming. He was no stranger to being recognized in public, but this felt different. There was no excitement, no admiration, just a quiet, lingering judgment. As he stood there, waiting for the maitre d' to return, Snoop overheard snippets of conversation from nearby tables. "Is that?" one woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the background noise. "I think it is," her companion replied. "What's he doing here?" another voice murmured, the tone laced with skepticism. Snoop kept his composure, his face calm and unreadable. He had dealt with this kind of reaction before, people who couldn't see past his image, who judged him based on stereotypes or preconceived notions. It wasn't new, but it still stung, especially on a night like this. He had just spent hours giving back to the community, spreading joy and hope to those who needed it most. And yet, here he was, being reduced to a subject of gossip and suspicion. The maitre d' returned, his polite smile firmly in place. "We do have a table available," he said, gesturing toward the back of the dining room. "If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your seat." Snoop nodded and followed the man through the restaurant, his presence drawing more stares as he walked past the tables. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers following in his wake. But he kept his head high, his stride confident. He wasn't about to let their judgment ruin his night. The table was tucked away in a quieter corner of the restaurant, offering a bit of privacy. As Snoop settled into his seat, the maitre d' handed him a menu and assured him that a server would be with him shortly. Snoop thanked him and opened the menu, his eyes scanning the list of dishes. Everything sounded incredible. Seared scallops, truffle risotto, dry-aged steak. It was the kind of menu that promised an unforgettable dining experience, and Snoop was determined to enjoy it, no matter the atmosphere. As he waited for the server, Snoop couldn't help but reflect on the contrast between this place and the community center he had been at just hours earlier. There, he had been surrounded by people who welcomed him with open arms, who saw him as a source of hope and inspiration. Here, he felt like an outsider, an intruder in a world that wasn't quite ready to accept him. It was a stark reminder of the divides that still existed, even in a season meant to bring people together. The server arrived, a young woman with a friendly smile that seemed genuine. "Good evening, sir," she said, her tone warm and professional. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Snoop ordered a glass of red wine, something smooth and full-bodied to match the richness of the menu. As the server walked away, he leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He wasn't going to let the stares or whispers get to him. He had come here for a good meal, and that's exactly what he intended to have. But even as he tried to focus on the food and the ambiance, Snoop couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, like a low hum in the background. He caught snippets of conversation, words like rapper, out of place, and doesn't belong. It was frustrating, but Snoop reminded himself that he had faced worse. He had built his career on defying expectations, on proving people wrong. Tonight would be no different. As the server returned with his wine and took his order, Snoop decided to let the food speak for itself. He was here to enjoy a meal, not to win anyone's approval. And as the first sip of wine warmed him from the inside out, he resolved to make the most of the night, no matter what anyone else thought. The warm glow of the restaurant's chandeliers and the soft hum of conversation filled the air, as Snoop Dogg sat at his table waiting for his server to return with his order. The festive decorations, the golden lights, and the towering Christmas tree in the center of the room all seemed to exude a sense of holiday cheer. But for Snoop, the atmosphere felt heavy, almost suffocating. The whispers and stares from the other diners hadn't stopped. He could feel their eyes on him, their judgment hanging in the air like an unspoken accusation. He had been in situations like this before. Fame had its perks, but it also came with its fair share of challenges. People often thought they knew him based on his music, his image, or the headlines they'd read. They didn't see the man behind the persona, the one who had just spent his evening giving back to the community, spreading joy to those who needed it most. Tonight, he had hoped to escape all of that, to enjoy a quiet meal and soak in the holiday spirit. But it seemed that even here, in this upscale restaurant, he couldn't escape the weight of other people's assumptions. As he waited, a server approached his table, her expression hesitant. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with a nervous energy that suggested she was new to the job. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polite but uncertain. "I'm sorry, but there seems to have been a mistake. This table is actually reserved for another party." Snoop raised an eyebrow, glancing around the room. There were plenty of empty tables, and the restaurant didn't seem overly crowded. "No problem," he said calmly, his voice steady. "I can move to another table." The server hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if seeking guidance. "Actually," she said, lowering her voice, "we're fully booked tonight. I'm afraid we won't be able to accommodate you." Snoop leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He could see through the excuse immediately. The restaurant wasn't full, far from it. There were at least half a dozen empty tables scattered throughout the dining room, and no one seemed to be waiting for a seat. This wasn't about availability. It was about something else entirely. "Fully booked, huh?" Snoop said, his tone light, but with an edge of skepticism. He glanced around the room again, making it clear that he wasn't buying the excuse. All right, I get it, no hard feelings. The server looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. I'm really sorry, sir, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's just, the manager said. Snoop held up a hand, cutting her off. It's cool, he said, offering her a small smile. I'll wait. You let me know when something opens up. The server nodded quickly, clearly relieved that he wasn't making a scene. She hurried away, leaving Snoop alone at the table. He could feel the tension in the room, the way the other diners were watching him out of the corners of their eyes. Some of them were whispering to each other, their voices low but not low enough to escape his notice. Why is he even here? One man muttered, his voice carrying just enough for Snoop to hear. This isn't his kind of place. Another voice chimed in, a woman's this time. I don't know what he was thinking, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. He doesn't belong here. Snoop kept his composure, his face calm and unreadable. He had heard it all before. The subtle and not so subtle comments, the judgment, the thinly veiled prejudice. It wasn't just about his fame or his music. It was about who he was, where he came from, and the assumptions people made about him because of it. At a nearby table, a group of older men were watching him openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disapproval. One of them leaned toward the others and said, loud enough for Snoop to hear, "This place has standards. I don't know how someone like him got in." The comment hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Snoop felt a flicker of anger, but he pushed it down. He had learned a long time ago that reacting to ignorance only gave it power. Instead, he chose to rise above it. He turned his attention back to the menu, pretending not to notice the stares or the whispers. After a moment, he closed the menu and leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed. He wasn't going to let their judgment ruin his night. He had come here for a good meal, and he was determined to enjoy it, no matter what anyone else thought. The server returned a few minutes later, her expression even more nervous than before. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "I spoke to the manager, and unfortunately, we really don't have any tables available tonight. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience." Snoop looked up at her, his gaze steady. He could see the discomfort in her eyes, the way she avoided looking directly at him. He knew she was just following orders, but it didn't make the situation any less frustrating. "All right," he said, his voice calm and even. "I'll wait. You let me know when something opens up." The server blinked, clearly surprised by his response. She had probably expected him to get angry, to demand to speak to the manager or make a scene, but Snoop wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. He had dealt with worse than this, and he wasn't going to let their prejudice get under his skin. As the server walked away, Snoop leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. He could still hear the whispers, the quiet murmurs of judgment and disapproval, but he didn't let it bother him. Instead, he focused on the reason he had come here in the first place, to enjoy a good meal and treat himself after a long day. He glanced around the room again, taking in the festive decorations and the warm glow of the chandeliers. Despite the tension in the air, there was something comforting about the atmosphere. It reminded him of why he loved Christmas, the sense of togetherness, the joy of giving, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with loved ones. He thought about the families he had met earlier that evening, the smiles on their faces as they received their gifts and shared in the holiday spirit. That was what Christmas was really about. Not the judgment or the prejudice, but the love and kindness that brought people together. Snoop took a deep breath and let it out slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. He wasn't going to let their ignorance ruin his night. He had faced bigger challenges than this, and he had always come out stronger. Tonight would be no different. As he sat there, waiting for a table that might never come, Snoop made a decision. He wasn't going to let their judgment define him. He was here to enjoy himself, and that's exactly what he intended to do. The tension in the dining room was palpable, but Snoop Dogg wasn't about to let it ruin his night. After being told there were no tables available, despite the obvious empty spots scattered throughout the restaurant, he decided to take a seat at the bar. It wasn't the cozy, candlelit table he had envisioned for his Christmas Eve dinner, but it would do. He wasn't here to make a scene or prove a point. He just wanted to enjoy a good meal and some peace of mind. The bar was sleek and modern, with a polished marble countertop that reflected the warm glow of the overhead lights. Bottles of liquor were arranged neatly on glass shelves behind the counter, their labels glinting like jewels. The bartender, a young man in his mid-20s, was busy wiping down glasses when Snoop approached. He looked up as Snoop took a seat, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. "Yo, no way," the bartender said, a grin spreading across his face. "You're Snoop Dogg, right?" Snoop nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's me," he said, his voice smooth and laid back. "What's good, man?" The bartender set down the glass he was cleaning and extended a hand. "I'm Jake," he said, shaking Snoop's hand enthusiastically. "Man, I can't believe you're here. I've been listening to your music since I was a kid. You're a legend." Snoop chuckled, his demeanor relaxed. "Appreciate that, Jake. You holding it down behind the bar tonight?" Jake nodded, his excitement evident. "Yeah, it's been a busy night, but this just made my whole shift. I never thought I'd get to meet you in person." Snoop leaned back on the bar stool, his posture casual. "Well, here I am. What you got on the menu? I'm trying to get something good to eat." Jake grabbed a menu from behind the bar and handed it to Snoop. "We've got some great stuff," he said. "The truffle fries are a favorite, and the steak is amazing. But if you're in the mood for something lighter, the seafood pasta is top-notch." Snoop scanned the menu, nodding thoughtfully. "All right, I'll take the steak, medium rare, and throw in some of those truffle fries, too." Jake grinned. "Good choice. I'll get that started for you." As Jake placed the order, Snoop took a moment to look around the bar area. It was quieter than the main dining room, with only a few other patrons seated nearby. The atmosphere was more relaxed, and for the first time that evening, Snoop felt like he could breathe. He turned back to Jake, who was now mixing a drink for another customer. "So, Jake," Snoop said, his tone conversational, "you been bartending long?" Jake glanced up, a smile on his face. "A couple of years," he said. "It's not my dream job, but it pays the bills while I'm figuring things out." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "What's the dream, then?" Jake hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to share, but then he shrugged, his expression earnest. "I want to be a music producer," he admitted. "I've been making beats in my free time, trying to get my name out there. It's tough, though. Sometimes it feels like I'm just spinning my wheels." Snoop nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I feel that," he said. "The grind ain't easy, but if you love it, you gotta keep pushing. You never know when your shot's gonna come." Jake's face lit up at the encouragement. "Man, that means a lot coming from you," he said. "Your music got me through some tough times, you know? Back in high school, things weren't great at home. But I'd put on your tracks and it was like, I don't know, like I could escape for a little while. It gave me hope." Snoop smiled, his eyes warm. "That's what it's all about, man," he said. "Music's supposed to lift you up, make you feel like you can handle whatever life throws at you. I'm glad my songs could do that for you." Jake nodded, his gratitude evident. "They really did. And now I'm trying to do the same thing with my beats. I want to make music that helps people, the way yours helped me." Snoop leaned forward, his tone serious but encouraging. "Then keep at it, Jake. Don't let nobody tell you you can't do it. If you got the passion, the rest will fall into place." Jake grinned, clearly inspired. "Thanks, Snoop. That means a lot." As they talked, the tension that had followed Snoop from the dining room began to fade. Jake's genuine enthusiasm and respect were a welcome change from the judgmental stares and whispers he had endured earlier. For the first time that night, Snoop felt like he was being seen for who he really was, not just a celebrity, but a person. Their conversation was interrupted by a small voice from behind Snoop. "Excuse me, are you Snoop Dogg?" Snoop turned to see a young boy, no older than 8 or 9, standing a few feet away. He was holding his mother's hand, his eyes wide with awe. Behind them stood the rest of their family, a father and a teenage girl, all of them looking at Snoop with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "That's me," Snoop said, his smile widening. "What's up, little man?" The boy's face lit up. "I love your music," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "My dad plays it all the time in the car. Can we take a picture with you?" Snoop chuckled, his heart warmed by the boy's enthusiasm. "Of course," he said. "Come on over." The family gathered around Snoop, their faces glowing with happiness. Jake offered to take the photo, and the boy handed him a phone. As they posed, the boy's mother spoke up. "We just want to say thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "Not just for your music, but for everything you do. We've seen the work you've done for the community, and it's inspiring. You've made such a difference." Snoop nodded, his smile softening. "I appreciate that," he said. "It means a lot to hear that." After the photo was taken, the boy's father shook Snoop's hand. "You've got a good heart," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Snoop thanked them, his mood lifted by their kindness. As the family returned to their table, he turned back to Jake, who was grinning from ear to ear. "Man," Jake said, shaking his head, "you really are the real deal." Snoop shrugged, his smile easy. "I'm just me, man, that's all I can be." As the night went on, Snoop and Jake continued to talk, their conversation flowing easily. The judgment and tension from earlier seemed like a distant memory, replaced by genuine connection and mutual respect. For Snoop, it was a reminder of what really mattered, not the stares or whispers, but the moments of kindness and understanding that brought people together. And on this Christmas Eve, that was more than enough. The festive warmth of the restaurant, with its golden lights and soft holiday music, was beginning to feel like a distant memory. Snoop Dogg, seated at the bar, had been doing his best to enjoy the evening despite the subtle and not-so-subtle tension that had followed him since he walked through the door. His conversation with Jake, the young bartender, had been a welcome distraction, and the brief interaction with the family who had recognized him had lifted his spirits. But as the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift. It started with the whispers. At first they were quiet, barely audible over the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation. But as more people noticed Snoop sitting at the bar, the murmurs grew louder. Heads turned, eyes lingered, and the air grew heavy with judgment. Snoop could feel it, the way the room seemed to close in around him, the way the energy shifted from festive to tense. He had been in the public eye long enough to recognize the signs. This wasn't admiration or curiosity. It was something colder, something rooted in prejudice and discomfort. At a table near the center of the dining room, a group of older patrons had been watching him since he arrived. Their expressions ranged from disapproval to outright disdain, and their conversation, though hushed at first, began to carry across the room. One man, dressed in an expensive suit and with a glass of red wine in hand, leaned back in his chair and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This isn't the kind of place for people like him," the man said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know what management was thinking letting him in here." The comment hung in the air, sharp and cutting. A few people at nearby tables glanced at the man, their expressions a mix of agreement and discomfort. Others looked toward Snoop, as if waiting to see how he would react. Jake, the bartender, froze mid-pour, his jaw tightening as he glanced nervously at Snoop. Snoop, for his part, didn't flinch. He had heard worse in his lifetime, and he wasn't about to let one man's ignorance get under his skin. Instead, he leaned back on his bar stool, his posture relaxed, and took a sip of the drink Jake had prepared for him. His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate the man further. "I mean, look at him," the man continued, gesturing toward Snoop with his wine glass. "This is a fine dining establishment, not some nightclub. He doesn't belong here." A few people chuckled uncomfortably, while others shifted in their seats, clearly unsure of how to respond. The tension in the room was palpable now, the festive cheer replaced by an undercurrent of hostility. Snoop could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes, but he refused to give them the reaction they were looking for. Instead, he turned to Jake and spoke in a low, even tone. "Don't worry about it, man," he said, his voice calm. "Some people just don't know how to mind their own business." Jake nodded, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "Some people just, they don't get it." Snoop shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It's all good. I've dealt with worse." But the tension didn't stop there. As the minutes passed, it became clear that the staff was in no hurry to serve him. Despite placing his order earlier, Snoop's food had yet to arrive, and the server who had taken his order seemed to be avoiding him entirely. Jake, noticing the delay, offered to check on the order, but Snoop waved him off. "Don't stress about it," he said. "I've got time." But the truth was, the delay was starting to wear on him. It wasn't just the wait, it was the principle of it. He could see the servers bustling around the dining room, attending to other tables with efficiency and care. Plates of steaming food were delivered to diners who had arrived long after him, while he sat at the bar, ignored and overlooked. It was clear that this wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. At another table, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered loudly enough for Snoop to hear, "I don't understand why he's even here. Doesn't he have his own kind of places to go to?" Her companion, a man in his 40s, chuckled and replied, "Guess he wanted to see how the other half lives." The words stung, but Snoop didn't let it show. He had spent his entire career breaking down barriers, proving people wrong and defying expectations. He wasn't about to let a few narrow-minded individuals ruin his night. Still, the blatant disrespect was hard to ignore. Jake, sensing Snoop's frustration, leaned in and spoke quietly. "I'm really sorry about all this," he said. "I don't know what's going on with the kitchen, but I'll make sure they get your order out as soon as possible." Snoop nodded, appreciating the young man's effort. "It's not your fault, Jake," he said. "You're doing your job. That's more than I can say for some people." As the night wore on, the tension in the room only seemed to grow. The whispers continued, the stares lingered, and the servers continued to avoid Snoop. It was as if the entire restaurant had decided to make him feel unwelcome, to send a message that he didn't belong. But Snoop refused to let them win. He sat at the bar, calm and composed, his presence a quiet act of defiance. At one point, the man in the suit who had made the earlier comments stood up from his table and approached the bar. He stopped a few feet away from Snoop, his expression smug. "You know," the man said, his tone condescending, "there are plenty of other places in the city where someone like you might feel more comfortable." Snoop turned to face him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, Snoop smiled, a slow, easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm comfortable right here," he said, his voice steady, "but thanks for your concern." The man's smirk faltered and he returned to his table, clearly annoyed that he hadn't gotten the reaction he was hoping for. Snoop watched him go, then turned back to Jake, who was watching the exchange with a mix of admiration and frustration. "You handled that like a pro," Jake said, shaking his head. "I don't know how you stay so calm." Snoop chuckled, his demeanor relaxed. "You learn to pick your battles," he said. "Some people ain't worth the energy." But even as he spoke, Snoop couldn't help but feel the weight of the evening pressing down on him. He had come here to enjoy a meal, to treat himself after a long day of giving back to the community. Instead, he had been met with judgment, hostility, and outright disrespect. It was a stark reminder of the barriers that still existed, even in a world that claimed to value equality and inclusion. As the night dragged on, Snoop's patience began to wear thin, but he refused to let them see him sweat. He had faced bigger challenges than this, and he wasn't about to let a few narrow-minded individuals ruin his night. Instead, he sat at the bar, calm and composed, a quiet symbol of resilience in the face of ignorance. The tension in the restaurant had reached its breaking point. Snoop Dogg, who had been sitting at his table for far too long without being served, was no longer able to ignore the blatant disrespect, the whispers, the stares, the deliberate neglect from the staff. It was all too much. He had come here to enjoy a quiet Christmas Eve dinner, to treat himself after a long day of giving back to the community. Instead, he had been met with hostility and prejudice, and now his patience had run out. Snoop sat at his table, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. His usually calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a simmering frustration that was impossible to hide. Across the room, the servers continued to avoid him, their eyes darting away whenever he tried to catch their attention. The other diners, meanwhile, were watching him with a mix of curiosity and judgment, their whispers growing louder with each passing moment. Finally, Snoop had had enough. He pushed back his chair, the sound of the legs scraping against the floor cutting through the low hum of conversation. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. He stood up slowly, his tall frame commanding attention, and looked around the room. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he began, his deep voice carrying across the room. "I came here to enjoy a Christmas dinner just like anyone else, but it seems like I'm not welcome here." The room remained silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Some of the diners looked away, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Others continued to stare, their expressions cold and unyielding. Snoop's gaze swept across the room, taking in the mix of reactions. He could see the shame in some faces, the discomfort in others. But there were still those who refused to acknowledge the truth of what he was saying, their expressions hard and unrepentant. "I've spent my whole life working hard," Snoop continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've given back to my community, I've helped people in need, and I've tried to make a difference in this world. And yet, here I am, being treated like I don't belong, like I'm not good enough to sit in this restaurant and enjoy a meal." A murmur rippled through the room, but no one spoke up. Snoop's words had struck a nerve, and the silence that followed was deafening. He could see the discomfort in the faces of the staff, the way they avoided his gaze. He could see the guilt in the eyes of some of the diners, the way they shifted in their seats, but he could also see the defiance in others, the way they crossed their arms and refused to look away. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Snoop said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm not asking for anything more than what anyone else in this room would expect. Respect, dignity, the chance to enjoy a meal without being judged or ignored." At that moment, one of the servers, a young woman with a nervous expression, stepped forward. She looked like she wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Snoop turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "It's not just about me," he said, his tone gentler now. "It's about what this says about us as people, about how we treat each other. Because if we can't show kindness and respect to one another, especially on a night like this, then what are we even doing?" The young woman nodded, her face pale. She looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. Snoop turned back to the room, his voice growing stronger. "I know not everyone in here feels the same way," he said. "I know there are good people in this room, people who believe in treating others with respect. And to those people, I say thank you. Thank you for being the kind of people who make this world a better place." A few people nodded, their expressions softening. One man, seated near the back of the room, even clapped quietly, though he quickly stopped when he realized no one else was joining in. Snoop smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture, even if it was small. "But to those of you who think it's okay to judge someone based on how they look, or where they come from, or what they do for a living," Snoop continued, his voice hardening, "I want you to think about what that says about you. Because it doesn't say anything about me, it says everything about you." The room was silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. Snoop could see the shame in some faces, the way people avoided his gaze. But there were still those who refused to be moved, their expressions cold and unyielding. Snoop didn't let it bother him. He had said what he needed to say, and that was enough. As he stood there, a small voice broke the silence. "He's right." Everyone turned to see a young boy, no older than 10, standing next to his parents. The boy looked up at Snoop with wide, earnest eyes. "He's right," the boy said again, his voice stronger this time. "It's Christmas. We're supposed to be kind to each other." The boy's parents looked embarrassed, but they didn't stop him. Snoop smiled at the boy, his heart warmed by the child's courage. "Thank you, little man," Snoop said, his voice soft. "You've got a good heart." The boy smiled back, and for a moment the tension in the room seemed to ease. Snoop turned back to the rest of the diners, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's night. I just want to be treated like a human being, that's all." With that, he sat back down at his table, his movements slow and deliberate. The room remained silent for a moment longer, and then, slowly, the conversations began to pick up again. But the atmosphere had changed. The whispers were quieter now, the stares less frequent. Snoop could feel the shift, the way his words had left an impact, even if some people refused to show it. A few minutes later, Jake, the bartender, approached Snoop's table with a plate of food. "Here you go," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I'm sorry for the wait." Snoop nodded, his expression softening. "Thanks, Jake. I appreciate it." As he began to eat, Snoop couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He hadn't come here to make a statement, but sometimes the moment called for it. And tonight, on Christmas Eve, he had reminded everyone in that room of the importance of kindness, respect, and humanity. It wasn't the night he had planned, but in its own way it was a night worth remembering. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted, but the tension still lingered in the air. Snoop Dogg sat at his table, calm but resolute, his earlier words still echoing in the minds of everyone present. The whispers had died down, replaced by a heavy silence as people reflected on what had just happened. Some diners avoided looking in his direction, while others stole glances, their expressions a mix of guilt and unease. The festive cheer that had once filled the room had been replaced by something more somber, a collective reckoning with the prejudice that had been laid bare. In the back of the restaurant, the owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Laurent, had just been informed of the situation. A server, pale and nervous, had hurriedly explained what had transpired, the neglect, the whispers, the outright hostility from some of the patrons. Mr. Laurent's face darkened as he listened, his jaw tightening with every word. This was not the kind of establishment he prided himself on running. He had built this restaurant on the principles of hospitality and respect, and the thought that someone, especially someone as well-known and respected as Snoop Dogg, had been treated so poorly under his roof filled him with shame. Without hesitation, Mr. Laurent straightened his tie and made his way to Snoop's table. The room seemed to hold its breath as the owner approached, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. When he reached the table, he paused for a moment, taking in the sight of Snoop sitting there, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp and watchful. Mr. Laurent cleared his throat, drawing the attention of not just Snoop, but the entire room. "Mr. Dogg," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I want to personally apologize for the way you've been treated tonight. This is not the kind of experience we strive to provide here, and I'm deeply sorry for the disrespect you've endured." Snoop looked up at the man, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, letting the weight of the moment settle. Mr. Laurent continued, his tone earnest. "I would like to offer you a complimentary meal as a gesture of our apology," he said. "It's the least we can do to try and make this right." For a moment, the room was silent, all eyes on Snoop. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady as he considered the offer. Then he shook his head slowly, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his tone measured. "But I don't need a free meal. That's not what this is about." Mr. Laurent looked taken aback, but he nodded, listening intently as Snoop continued. "All I want is to be treated fairly," Snoop said, his voice carrying across the room. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I didn't come here expecting special treatment. I just wanted to enjoy a meal like anyone else. But instead I got judged, ignored, disrespected, and that's not okay." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Mr. Laurent nodded again, his expression one of genuine remorse. "You're absolutely right," he said, "and I take full responsibility for what's happened tonight. I will be speaking with my staff to ensure that something like this never happens again. You have my word." Snoop nodded, appreciating the sincerity in the man's voice. "That's all I ask," he said simply. As Mr. Laurent stepped back, the room seemed to exhale. The tension that had gripped the restaurant began to ease, replaced by a sense of reflection. People shifted in their seats, their expressions thoughtful. It was clear that Snoop's words had struck a chord, forcing them to confront their own biases and assumptions. A few moments later, an older woman, her silver hair neatly styled and her posture elegant, stood up from her table. She hesitated for a moment, clutching her purse tightly, before making her way over to Snoop's table. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and the room watched her with quiet curiosity. When she reached Snoop, she stopped and looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and determination. "Excuse me, Mr. Dogg," she said, her voice soft but steady. "May I have a moment of your time?" Snoop looked up at her, his expression curious but open. "Of course," he said, gesturing for her to speak. The woman took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in front of her. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice wavering. "When you first walked in, I judged you. I let my assumptions and my prejudices cloud my judgment, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Snoop's expression softened as he listened, his eyes meeting hers. The sincerity in her voice was undeniable, and he could see the weight of her words in the way she held herself. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by certain ideas," the woman continued, her voice growing stronger. "Ideas about people, about who belongs where, about what's proper. And tonight, I realized how wrong those ideas are. You didn't deserve to be treated the way you were, and I'm ashamed that I was a part of it." Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong," he said. "I respect that." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said, "and thank you for speaking up. You reminded me, and I think a lot of us, of what really matters: kindness, respect, treating people like human beings." Snoop smiled, a warm, genuine smile that lit up his face. "That's all I'm trying to do," he said. "Spread a little love, you know?" The woman nodded, her smile growing. "Well, you've done that tonight," she said, "and I'm grateful for it." With that, she returned to her table, her steps lighter than before. The room, which had been so tense and hostile earlier, now felt different. The energy had shifted, the air filled with a sense of understanding and reconciliation. A few other diners, inspired by the woman's courage, approached Snoop to offer their own apologies, their words heartfelt and sincere. By the end of the night, the restaurant felt transformed. The hostility and judgment that had once filled the room had been replaced by something warmer, something more human. Snoop, for his part, remained gracious, accepting each apology with humility and grace. He hadn't come here to make a statement, but in standing up for himself, he had reminded everyone in that room of the power of kindness and the importance of treating each other with respect. As he prepared to leave, Mr. Laurent approached him once more. "Thank you, Mr. Dogg," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Not just for your patience, but for your words. You've given us all something to think about." Snoop nodded, his smile easy but genuine. "That's what Christmas is all about, right?" he said. "Learning, growing, and spreading a little love." With that, he left the restaurant, his head held high. And though the night hadn't gone as he had planned, he couldn't help but feel that it had been a night worth remembering. For in standing up for himself, he had not only changed the hearts and minds of those around him, but had also reminded them of the true spirit of the season. The night outside the restaurant was cold, the kind of crisp winter chill that made people pull their coats tighter and their scarves higher. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional sound of car tires crunching over snow and the faint hum of Christmas music drifting from nearby shops. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The tension and judgment that had once filled the room had been replaced by a sense of reflection, and for some, guilt. Snoop Dogg, however, wasn't one to dwell on negativity. He had made his point, and now he was ready to turn the night into something positive, something that truly embodied the spirit of Christmas. As he sat at his table, finishing the meal that had finally been served to him, an idea began to form in his mind. He glanced out the window, where he could see a few people huddled on the sidewalk, their breath visible in the freezing air. They were bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, their faces weary but hopeful as they watched the festive lights twinkle in the distance. Snoop's heart ached for them. He had spent much of his life giving back to those in need, and tonight he realized was an opportunity to do just that. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. The conversation was brief, but by the time he hung up, a smile had spread across his face. He stood up, his tall frame drawing the attention of everyone in the room once again. The diners, who had been quietly eating and reflecting, turned to look at him, their expressions curious. "All right, y'all," Snoop said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet hum of the restaurant. "I've got an idea. Christmas is about sharing and showing love, right? So let's do something special tonight." The room was silent, the diners unsure of what he meant. Snoop didn't wait for a response. He walked over to the restaurant's front door, opened it, and stepped outside. The cold air hit him immediately, but he didn't mind. He looked down the street, his eyes scanning for the familiar sight of the food truck he had just called. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the truck pulled up, its bright lights cutting through the darkness. The side of the truck was painted with vibrant colors, and the words "Soulful Bites" were emblazoned across it in bold, cheerful letters. The driver, a cheerful man named Marcus, hopped out and greeted Snoop with a wide grin. "Snoop, you called, and I came running. What's the plan, my man?" Snoop clapped Marcus on the back, his own grin just as wide. "We're going to feed some people tonight," he said. "Not just the folks in the restaurant, but anyone who needs a hot meal. It's Christmas, man. Let's spread some love." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "You got it. Let's do this." Snoop turned back to the restaurant, where the diners were now watching him through the windows, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity. He stepped back inside, his voice booming as he addressed the room. "All right, everybody," he said, his tone warm and inviting. "I've got a food truck outside and we're serving up some Christmas cheer. That means free food for everyone, no exceptions. And I'm not just talking about y'all in here. I'm talking about anyone who needs a meal tonight. So if you know someone who's out there in the cold, bring them here. Let's make this a night to remember." The room was silent for a moment, the diners processing what he had just said. Then, slowly, a few people began to smile. One man stood up, clapping his hands together. "That's a beautiful idea," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Others nodded in agreement, their initial hesitation melting away. Snoop didn't wait for further reactions. He stepped outside again, this time walking down the street to where a small group of homeless individuals had gathered. They looked up at him, their faces wary but curious. Snoop approached them with a warm smile, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "Hey, y'all," he said, his tone gentle. "I've got a food truck over here, and we're serving up some hot meals. No strings attached. Come on over and get yourself something to eat." The group exchanged glances, their initial skepticism giving way to gratitude. One woman, her face lined with years of hardship, stepped forward. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Snoop nodded. "Dead serious," he said. "It's Christmas and nobody should go hungry tonight. Come on, let's get you fed." The woman smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you so much." Word spread quickly. Within minutes, a line had formed outside the food truck, a mix of restaurant patrons, homeless individuals, and even a few passers-by who had heard about what was happening. Marcus and his team worked tirelessly, serving up steaming plates of soul food: fried chicken, mac and cheese, collard greens, cornbread, and more. The air was filled with the mouth-watering aroma of freshly cooked food, and the sound of laughter and conversation began to replace the earlier tension. Snoop stood near the truck, greeting people as they came up to get their meals. He took the time to talk to everyone, his warmth and charisma putting them at ease. For many, it was the first time in a long time that they had felt truly seen and valued. Inside the restaurant, the diners watched the scene unfold with a mix of awe and admiration. A few of them decided to join in, stepping outside to help serve food or simply to share in the experience. Even the staff, who had been so hesitant and dismissive earlier, found themselves moved by Snoop's generosity. One server, the young woman who had been too nervous to speak up earlier, approached Snoop with a shy smile. "Mr. Dogg," she said, her voice quiet, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. You've reminded us all what Christmas is really about." Snoop smiled at her, his expression kind. "It's all love," he said. "That's what it's about, spreading love and lifting each other up." As the night went on, the line outside the food truck began to dwindle, but the sense of community and warmth only grew stronger. People who had been strangers just hours ago were now laughing and talking like old friends, brought together by the simple act of sharing a meal. Snoop watched it all with a sense of quiet satisfaction. This was what Christmas was supposed to be about, not judgment or exclusion, but love, kindness, and the joy of giving. As the last plate was served and the food truck began to pack up, Snoop turned to the crowd, his voice carrying over the chatter. "Merry Christmas, y'all," he said, his tone filled with warmth. "Remember, it's not about what you've got or where you're from. It's about how you treat the people around you. Let's keep spreading that love, not just tonight, but every day." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their faces lit with gratitude and joy. Snoop smiled, his heart full. It hadn't been the night he had planned, but it had turned into something far more meaningful. As he walked away, the sound of laughter and celebration followed him, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice and hardship, the power of love and kindness could bring people together. The cold winter night outside the restaurant had transformed into something magical. What had started as a tense and uncomfortable evening had blossomed into a celebration of togetherness, kindness, and the true spirit of Christmas. The food truck parked in front of the restaurant had become the centerpiece of an impromptu outdoor Christmas party, and the once quiet street was now alive with laughter, conversation, and the warm glow of holiday cheer. The aroma of soul food filled the air, mingling with the crisp scent of snow and the faint piney smell of the Christmas wreaths hanging on nearby lampposts. People from all walks of life, restaurant patrons in their fancy coats, homeless individuals bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, and even passers-by who had been drawn in by the commotion, gathered together, plates in hand, sharing food and stories. The barriers that had once divided them seemed to melt away in the warmth of the moment. Snoop Dogg stood near the food truck, a plate of fried chicken and mac and cheese in one hand and a cup of hot cider in the other. His presence, larger than life yet approachable, seemed to radiate a sense of calm and joy. He moved through the crowd, stopping to chat with people, cracking jokes and making everyone feel welcome. His laughter was infectious, and his genuine warmth set the tone for the entire gathering. Nearby, a group of children, their cheeks rosy from the cold, were playing in the snow. They had built a small snowman, complete with a scarf and a crooked carrot nose, and were now chasing each other around, their giggles ringing out like music. Snoop watched them with a smile, his heart full. This was what Christmas was supposed to be about: joy, connection, and the simple pleasure of being together. At one of the makeshift tables set up near the food truck, a group of restaurant patrons sat side by side with some of the homeless individuals who had been invited to join the feast. The contrast between their appearances, designer coats and polished shoes next to worn jackets and scuffed boots, was stark, but it no longer seemed to matter. They were laughing together, sharing stories, and passing plates of food back and forth as if they had known each other for years. One of the restaurant patrons, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, leaned over to the older woman sitting next to him. She was one of the homeless individuals who had been hesitant to join the gathering at first, but now she was smiling, her face lit with a warmth that hadn't been there before. "I have to admit," the man said, his voice tinged with regret, "when I first saw Snoop Dogg walk into the restaurant tonight, I judged him. I thought he didn't belong there, but now, I see how wrong I was. He's done more to bring people together tonight than I ever could have imagined." The woman nodded, her smile softening. "It's easy to judge people when you don't know their story," she said, "but tonight he's shown us all what it means to be kind and generous. It's a lesson I won't forget." At another table, a group of younger diners who had initially been part of the whispering and judgment inside the restaurant were now deep in conversation with a man who had been living on the streets for years. He was telling them about his life, the struggles he had faced, and the small moments of kindness that had kept him going. The young diners listened intently, their expressions a mix of empathy and shame as they realized how quick they had been to judge him earlier. One of the young women spoke up, her voice quiet but sincere. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the way I acted earlier. I didn't even give you a chance, and that was wrong." The man smiled, his eyes kind. "It's all right," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that you're here now, and you're willing to listen. That means more than you know." Nearby, the older woman who had apologized to Snoop earlier in the evening was now helping to serve food from the truck. She moved with purpose, her earlier hesitation replaced by a sense of determination. As she handed a plate of food to a young man who had been sitting on the sidewalk, she smiled warmly. "Merry Christmas," she said, her voice filled with genuine kindness. The young man looked up at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "Thank you," he said softly. "Merry Christmas to you too." The woman turned to Snoop, who was standing nearby, and gave him a small nod. "You were right," she said. "Christmas is about sharing and showing love. Thank you for reminding me of that." Snoop smiled, his expression gentle. "It's never too late to spread a little love," he said. "That's what it's all about." As the night went on, the party grew even more lively. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and soon music filled the air. Snoop, never one to miss an opportunity to entertain, grabbed a microphone and began to freestyle, his rhymes playful and full of holiday cheer. The crowd cheered and clapped along, their spirits lifted by his energy and charisma. A few people began to dance, their movements awkward at first but soon growing more confident as the music and laughter encouraged them. Even the restaurant staff, who had been so hesitant and dismissive earlier in the evening, joined in, their faces lit with smiles as they served food and mingled with the crowd. The sense of division that had once permeated the restaurant was gone, replaced by a feeling of unity and connection. People who had been strangers just hours ago were now laughing and talking like old friends, brought together by the simple act of sharing a meal in a moment of kindness. As the night began to wind down, Snoop stood near the food truck, watching the scene with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had come to the restaurant that evening hoping for a simple Christmas dinner, but the night had turned into something far more meaningful. In standing up for himself and for what was right, he had not only changed the hearts and minds of those around him, but had also created a moment of joy and connection that none of them would forget. One of the restaurant patrons, a man who had been particularly vocal in his judgment earlier in the evening, approached Snoop, his expression humble. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I was wrong to judge you, and I'm sorry. You've shown me what it really means to be a good person tonight." Snoop nodded, his smile kind. "It's all good, man," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." The man nodded, his gratitude evident. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." As the last of the food was served and the crowd began to disperse, Snoop took a moment to reflect on the night. It hadn't gone the way he had planned, but in many ways, it had been better than he could have imagined. He had reminded everyone, himself included, of the power of kindness, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the true meaning of Christmas. As he walked away from the gathering, the sound of laughter and music still ringing in his ears, Snoop couldn't help but smile. It had been a night to remember, a night that had brought people together and reminded them of the simple truth, that love, kindness, and understanding were the greatest gifts of all. The night had grown late, and the once bustling street outside the restaurant was beginning to quiet down. The food truck had served its last plate, and the crowd that had gathered for the impromptu Christmas celebration was starting to thin. The air was still cold, but it no longer felt biting. Instead, it carried a warmth that came not from the weather, but from the shared experience of the evening. Laughter and conversation still lingered in the air, and the glow of the streetlights reflected off the snow, giving the scene a magical, almost ethereal quality. Snoop Dogg stood near the food truck, watching as people began to say their goodbyes. Some hugged each other, others exchanged phone numbers, and a few simply smiled and nodded, their hearts full from the night's events. It was a scene of connection and humanity, a stark contrast to the tension and division that had marked the beginning of the evening. Snoop felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he took it all in. This was what Christmas was supposed to be about, bringing people together, breaking down barriers, and spreading love. As the last of the food truck staff began to pack up, Marcus, the owner of the truck, walked over to Snoop. "Man, you really turned this night around," Marcus said, his voice filled with admiration. "I've done a lot of events, but I've never seen anything like this. You've got a way of bringing people together, Snoop." Snoop smiled, his expression humble. "It ain't about me, man," he said. "It's about the people. Sometimes all it takes is a little reminder of what really matters." Marcus nodded, clapping Snoop on the shoulder. "Well, you gave us all that reminder tonight. Merry Christmas, brother." "Merry Christmas," Snoop replied, his smile widening. As the crowd began to gather closer, sensing that the night was coming to an end, Snoop stepped forward. He stood in the center of the group, his tall frame silhouetted against the glow of the streetlights. The conversations quieted, and all eyes turned to him. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone knew that this moment would be the final, lasting memory of the night. Snoop took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He saw faces of all kinds, young and old, rich and poor, black and white. Some were familiar, others were strangers. But in this moment, they were all connected, brought together by a shared experience that had transcended their differences. "All right, y'all," Snoop began, his deep voice carrying over the quiet murmurs of the crowd. "Before we wrap this up, I just want to say a few words." The crowd fell completely silent, their attention focused entirely on him. Snoop paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his tone was warm but serious, filled with the weight of the night's events. "Tonight started out rough," he said. "I walked into that restaurant just looking for a meal, and instead I got judged, ignored, disrespected. And I know I'm not the only one who's been through that. A lot of y'all out here tonight know what it feels like to be looked at and not really seen, to be judged before you even get a chance to show who you really are." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd nodded, their expressions somber. Many of them had experienced the same kind of prejudice and judgment that Snoop was describing, and his words resonated deeply. "But here's the thing," Snoop continued, his voice growing stronger. "We don't have to stay stuck in that. We don't have to let those judgments define us or each other. Tonight we proved that. We came together, we shared a meal, we laughed, we talked, and in doing that, we broke down some of those walls. We showed that it's possible to see each other for who we really are, not just what we look like or where we come from." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces lighting up with understanding. Snoop's words were simple, but they carried a profound truth. "I hope that from now on," Snoop said, his voice softening, "we'll look at each other with our hearts, not with our prejudices. Because when we do that, we see the things that really matter. We see kindness, we see strength, we see humanity." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, growing louder with each passing second. Snoop smiled, his heart full as he looked out at the sea of faces. He could see the impact his words were having, the way they were resonating with people on a deep personal level. "And one more thing," Snoop added, raising his hand to quiet the applause. "Christmas ain't just about one night. It's about how we live every day. So let's take what we learned tonight and carry it with us. Let's keep spreading love, not just during the holidays, but all year round. That's how we make the world a better place." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause echoing down the street. Some people wiped away tears, moved by the sincerity and power of Snoop's message. Others simply smiled, their hearts lighter than they had been in a long time. It was a moment of pure connection, a reminder of the good that could come from even the most difficult situations. As the applause began to die down, Snoop stepped back, his smile warm and genuine. He waved to the crowd, his voice carrying over the lingering cheers. "Merry Christmas, y'all," he said. "Stay blessed." "Merry Christmas!" the crowd shouted back, their voices filled with gratitude and joy. Snoop turned and began to walk away, his figure disappearing into the snowy night. The crowd watched him go, their hearts full of admiration and respect. He had come to the restaurant that evening as just another diner, but he was leaving as something much more, a symbol of kindness, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. In the days that followed, the story of Snoop Dogg's Christmas night spread far and wide. People shared videos and photos of the outdoor feast, along with stories of the lessons they had learned. News outlets picked up the story, and social media buzzed with praise for Snoop's actions. His words, "Look at each other with your hearts, not with your prejudices," became a rallying cry for kindness and understanding, a reminder of the true meaning of Christmas. For those who had been there that night, the memory of the impromptu celebration would stay with them forever. It wasn't just a meal or a party, it was a moment of transformation, a night when strangers became friends and barriers were broken down. And at the center of it all was Snoop Dogg, a man who had turned a moment of prejudice into a powerful lesson in love and humanity. As the snow continued to fall and the world moved on, the spirit of that night lived on in the hearts of everyone who had been there. It was a reminder that even in the face of judgment and division, the power of kindness and connection could bring people together, and that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all.